When you open most history textbooks, the story of World War II begins with a single date, September 1st, 1939, the day Hitler's Wehrmacht crossed the Polish border. But what if I told you that the real origins of the deadliest conflict in human history have nothing to do with that date? What if the roots of World War II were planted not by generals but by bankers? Not on battlefields, but in boardrooms? The conventional narrative is clean. It's simple. A mad dictator seizes power in Germany. He builds an army. He invades Poland. The Allies fight back. Good triumphs over evil. End of story. But this version conveniently ignores some uncomfortable questions. Where did a bankrupt, humiliated Germany get the money to build the most powerful military machine in Europe in just 6 years? How did a country crushed by reparations and hyperinflation transform into an industrial war engine? And why did some of the most powerful companies in America continue doing business with the Nazi regime, even as storm clouds gathered over Europe? The answers reveal a story that's far more complex, far more unsettling, and far more relevant to understanding how global catastrophes actually happen. This is the story of how World War II was financed into existence, and it begins not in 1939, but 20 years earlier, in a palace outside Paris. In June 1919, world leaders gathered at the Palace of Versailles to impose peace terms on a defeated Germany. The Great War had killed nearly 20 million people and devastated an entire continent. The victors wanted revenge, and they wanted to make sure Germany could never threaten them again. The resulting Treaty of Versailles did more than end a war. It planted the seeds for the next one. Under Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for causing the war. This wasn't just a moral condemnation, it was the legal basis for crippling financial reparations. The Allies demanded Germany pay for all civilian damages caused by the conflict. In 1921, the final bill came due. 132 billion gold marks, roughly equivalent to $33 billion at the time. Adjusted for inflation, that's somewhere around $400 billion today. For context, Germany had already been stripped of 13% of its territory and 12% of its population. The land taken included 48% of Germany's iron production capacity and a significant portion of its coal resources. The German military was slashed to just 100,000 soldiers. The Navy was limited to 15,000 sailors and banned from operating submarines. The British economist John Maynard Keynes, who had served as the principal representative of the British Treasury at the Paris Peace Conference, was horrified. In his 1919 book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, he called the treaty a Carthaginian peace, a reference to Rome's complete destruction of Carthage. He warned that the reparations were many times more than Germany could possibly pay, and that demanding them would produce drastic instability. Keynes wrote what would become one of the most prophetic statements of the 20th century. He said, "I believe that the campaign for securing out of Germany the general costs of the war was one of the most serious acts of political unwisdom for which our statesmen have ever been responsible." He was right, but not in the way you might think. The conventional narrative tells us that the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh, and that German resentment over its terms fueled Hitler's rise. This is partly true, but it misses the bigger picture. The real problem wasn't just that the treaty was punitive, it was that the entire financial architecture built to enforce it created a catastrophic web of debts, loans, and dependencies that would eventually collapse and bring the world down with it. Here's what happened. Germany couldn't pay the reparations. This shouldn't have surprised anyone. The country's economy was shattered, its industrial base diminished, its currency worthless. By 1923, hyperinflation had become so severe that the German mark traded at 4.2 trillion to $1. People literally needed wheelbarrows full of cash to buy a loaf of bread. When Germany defaulted on its coal and timber deliveries in 1923, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. German workers responded with passive resistance. The government supported them by printing even more money, accelerating the hyperinflationary spiral. It was economic chaos. This is where the story gets interesting, because into this chaos stepped the United States, not with soldiers, but with something far more powerful, capital. In late 1923, with Europe on the brink of financial collapse, the Reparations Commission formed a committee of experts to find a solution. The committee was chaired by an American banker named Charles G. Dawes, and what they proposed would change the course of history. The Dawes Plan, adopted in 1924, was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. It restructured German reparation payments to make them more manageable in the short term. But more importantly, it opened the floodgates for American capital to pour into Germany. Germany was loaned 800 million Reichsmarks to stabilize its currency and rebuild its economy. About half of this sum was raised through Wall Street bond issues. The financier J.P. Morgan floated the loan on the American market, and it was quickly oversubscribed. American investors, flush with cash during the Roaring '20s, couldn't get enough. Over the next 4 years, American banks continued to lend Germany enormous sums. By 1929, foreign loans worth more than 10 billion Reichsmarks had flowed into Germany. Some estimates suggest U.S. loans under the Dawes Plan and the subsequent Young Plan exceeded $3 billion. And here's the thing that most history books gloss over. This created a bizarre circular flow of money. American banks lent money to Germany. Germany used that money to pay reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain used those reparation payments to service their war debts to the United States. In effect, American capital was flowing out and then flowing right back in. Everyone seemed to win. American investors earned interest. Germany got economic recovery. France and Britain got their reparations. The Golden Twenties began. German unemployment fell, industrial production soared, and the Weimar Republic finally seemed stable. But there was a fundamental flaw in this system. Germany wasn't actually generating the wealth to pay its debts. It was borrowing the money to pay them. And the moment American credit stopped flowing, the entire edifice would collapse like a house of cards. That moment came on October 24th, 1929. Black Thursday, the Wall Street crash. When American banks failed, they called in their foreign loans. The river of capital that had been sustaining Germany dried up overnight. Between 1929 and 1932, German industrial production fell by roughly 40%. Unemployment skyrocketed from 1.4 million to over 6 million. At the height of the crisis, 1/3 of German workers had no job. Wages fell by 39%. Banks collapsed. Businesses shuttered. People starved. The Weimar government's response made things worse. Afraid of reigniting hyperinflation, Chancellor Heinrich Brüning implemented austerity measures, cutting spending and wages at precisely the moment the economy needed stimulus. It was economic malpractice on a national scale. And into this chaos stepped Adolf Hitler. In the 1928 elections, Hitler's Nazi Party had won just 2.6% of the vote. They were a fringe movement, dismissed by most Germans as extremist cranks. But the Great Depression changed everything. By the September 1930 elections, with unemployment ravaging the country, the Nazis surged to 18.3% of the vote, becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag. By July 1932, they had captured 37%, making them the largest party in parliament. Historians have long debated the exact relationship between economic conditions and Nazi voting. Recent research has provided some striking answers. A 2019 study published by the Center for Economic Policy Research found that cities more exposed to failing German banks saw dramatically higher support for the Nazi Party. When the major banks, Donat Bank and Dresdner Bank, collapsed in 1931, triggering a full-blown financial crisis, the political landscape transformed. The researchers found that economic collapse was one crucial mechanism linking the banking crisis to Nazi voting. While unemployment alone didn't perfectly correlate with Nazi support, income declines, driven by bank failures, strongly increased votes for Hitler's party. A one standard deviation decline in income caused by bank failures was associated with a 4.3% rise in Nazi support. But it wasn't just economic factors. The banking crisis also operated through psychological channels. Even after controlling for changes in economic fundamentals, higher exposure to failing banks directly increased Nazi voting. The trauma of seeing financial institutions collapse, the fear and uncertainty it generated, made people more susceptible to extremist messages promising order and stability. Hitler understood this perfectly. He positioned himself as the savior who would rescue Germany from the chaos created by democratic institutions that had failed. He blamed the Treaty of Versailles. He blamed the Jews. He blamed the communists. He blamed the November criminals who had surrendered German honor in 1918. He promised to tear up the despised peace treaty, restore German pride, rebuild the military, and create jobs for the unemployed. And he had financial backing. While the Nazi Party drew support from mass movements, it also received significant funding from German industrialists who saw Hitler as a bulwark against communism and a potential route to power. Men like Fritz Thyssen, the steel magnate, poured money into the party. The connection between big business and Nazi rise to power is complicated, but money unquestionably flowed. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. He had not won an outright majority. He had not staged a coup. He had been handed power through backroom dealings among conservative politicians who thought they could control him. They were wrong. Now comes the part of the story that gets really uncomfortable. Because Hitler didn't rebuild Germany's military and economy alone. He had help from some very unlikely sources. In October 1936, the U.S. ambassador to Nazi Germany, William Dodd, wrote a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt that revealed a shocking truth. Ambassador Dodd reported that more than 100 American corporations have subsidiaries here or cooperative understandings with Nazi Germany. Let's start with Ford. Henry Ford was not merely a businessman who happened to do business with Germany. He was a dedicated anti-Semite whose writings directly influenced Hitler. Ford's newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, published a series of articles in the early 1920s alleging a Jewish conspiracy to take over America. These were compiled into 4 volumes called The International Jew. Hitler read them in German. He kept a portrait of Henry Ford in his office. In Mein Kampf, Hitler praised Ford as the only American who had resisted Jewish influence. In July 1938, Hitler awarded Ford the Order of the German Eagle, first class, the highest decoration Nazi Germany could bestow on a foreigner. Ford accepted it. Ford's German subsidiary, Ford Werk, operated throughout the Nazi period. Construction of Ford trucks assembled in Cologne was completed just in time for Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. Between 1942 and 1944, the Ford plant in Cologne constructed about 10,000 half-tracks for the German army. By 1942, of the Wehrmacht's 350,000 trucks in service, around 33% were produced at Ford factories in the Reich. A U.S. Army report dated September 5, 1945, directly accused Ford's German subsidiary of serving as an arsenal of Nazism, at least for military vehicles, with the knowledge and consent of the parent company in Dearborn, Michigan. Then there's General Motors. GM's Opel division was the largest car maker in Germany. Together, Ford and General Motors' German affiliates controlled 70% of the German auto market at the outbreak of war in 1939. They quickly retooled to supply military trucks that the Nazis used to invade Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. The head of General Motors at the time was James Mooney, who was an ardent opponent of the New Deal and an admirer of Adolf Hitler. Like Ford, Mooney received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle from Hitler. But perhaps no story is more chilling than that of IBM. The Nazi regime made extensive use of Hollerith punch card and accounting equipment manufactured by IBM's German subsidiary, Deutsche Hollerith Maschinen GmbH, known as Dehomag. This technology was critical to Nazi census operations, which were used to identify Jews and other targeted groups. Edwin Black, in his extensively researched book IBM and the Holocaust, documents how IBM's machines were used in concentration camps to track prisoners, catalog their movements, and manage the logistics of mass murder. Each concentration camp operated a Hollerith department called Hollerith Abteilung. SS personnel were trained by IBM technicians to use the machines. IBM has criticized some of this research, but has not denied the fundamental charges. The company has made generous donations to Holocaust Memorial Funds. Make of that what you will. Standard Oil of New Jersey maintained a close relationship with IG Farben, the giant German chemical conglomerate. According to Ambassador Dodd, Standard Oil sent $2 million to Nazi Germany in December 1933. The company was also making $500,000 a year helping Germany produce synthetic fuel, an essential substance for military vehicles. IG Farben, for its part, would later produce Zyklon B, the gas used in the Holocaust death camps. The company also operated factories at Auschwitz using slave labor. When the U.S. entered World War II in December 1941, American corporate investments in Nazi Germany totaled more than $450 million. Major companies with significant German holdings included not just Ford, GM, IBM, and Standard Oil, but also International Telephone and Telegraph, Eastman Kodak, Singer, International Harvester, Gillette, Coca-Cola, Kraft, Westinghouse, and United Fruit. Some of these companies continued operations in Germany throughout the war. Some used slave labor. Some had their German profits held until after the war, at which point they reclaimed them. And here's perhaps the most extraordinary fact. The U.S. government, after the war, actually paid Ford and General Motors compensation for damage done by Allied bombers to their German factories. So how did Hitler's Germany, bankrupt and disarmed, transform into a military superpower capable of conquering most of Europe in just 6 years? Part of the answer lies in creative financing. When Hitler came to power in 1933, unemployment was close to 30%. The Nazi government initially continued economic policies begun under previous administrations, including large public works programs funded by deficit spending. The famous Autobahn highway system was one such project, but the real economic transformation came from rearmament. Hitler made rebuilding Germany's military his top priority, and he disguised military spending as job creation to conceal violations of the Treaty of Versailles. The key figure here was Hjalmar Schacht, whom Hitler appointed as president of the Reichsbank in 1933 and minister of economics in 1934. Schacht created a scheme for deficit financing using promissory notes called Mefo bills. These were essentially IOUs that could be used to pay for military equipment without the spending showing up in government budgets. The system worked for a while. German unemployment fell dramatically. By 1938, it was practically extinct. Industrial production soared. The German people, who had suffered through hyperinflation, depression, and mass unemployment, experienced what felt like an economic miracle. But it was built on a foundation of debt and deception. By 1938, the system was straining. A large share of Mefo bills fell due, and the government had to resort to highly dubious methods, forcing banks to buy government bonds and taking money from savings accounts and insurance companies. The Nazi economic model was fundamentally unsustainable without conquest. Hitler believed in war as the engine of human progress and argued that the purpose of a country's economy should be to enable it to fight and win wars. His entire economic strategy was oriented toward preparing for military expansion. The resources Germany needed, particularly oil and iron, would have to be taken from other nations. The conquest of Lebensraum, living space, in Eastern Europe, was not an ideological afterthought. It was an economic necessity built into the very structure of the Nazi economy. So what do we learn from all this? What did historians get wrong about the origins of World War II? First, they often underestimate the economic dimensions of the conflict. The Treaty of Versailles was not just a political document, it was an economic weapon that destabilized Europe for 2 decades. The financial system built to enforce it, with its circular flows of debt and capital, was inherently fragile. When it collapsed, it brought democracy down with it. Second, they sometimes portray Hitler's rise as inevitable, driven by German national character or the appeal of Nazi ideology. But the evidence suggests that, without the Great Depression, the Nazis might have remained a fringe movement. Economic collapse created the conditions for extremism. Financial crisis paved Hitler's path to power. Third, and most uncomfortably, they often minimize the role of international capital, including American capital, in enabling Nazi Germany. The Dawes Plan and the Young Plan were celebrated at the time as diplomatic achievements. Charles Dawes won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. But these plans pumped billions into Germany without creating sustainable economic structures. And when the credit stopped, catastrophe followed. Finally, they sometimes treat American corporate involvement with Nazi Germany as a minor embarrassment rather than a fundamental part of the story. Ford, GM, IBM, Standard Oil, and dozens of other companies provided the Third Reich with trucks, technology, fuel, and financing. Some continued doing so even after war broke out in Europe. Their executives received Nazi medals. Their factories used slave labor. And after the war, most faced no serious consequences. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history. The records are in archives. The evidence was presented at the Nuremberg trials. Congressional investigations examine these relationships. The information is available to anyone who looks for it. But it complicates the clean narrative. It suggests that the Second World War was not simply a battle between good and evil, but also a crisis produced by systemic economic failures and enabled by profit-seeking businesses that placed their bottom lines above any consideration of morality. Nearly 80 years after the end of World War II, why does any of this matter? Because the forces that produced that catastrophe haven't disappeared. Economic instability still creates opportunities for extremism. Financial crises still undermine democracies. Corporations still do business with regimes that violate human rights. And the connections between money and power are still obscured behind layers of complexity that most people never penetrate. The conventional story of World War II teaches us to watch out for dictators, to defend democracy, to never forget the Holocaust. These are important lessons, but they're incomplete. The deeper lesson is that catastrophes of this magnitude don't emerge from nowhere. They're built over decades through thousands of individual decisions, most of which seem rational or even beneficial at the time. A treaty designed to ensure peace, loans intended to stabilize an economy, business relationships that create jobs and profits. Each step makes sense in isolation. Together, they create the conditions for disaster. John Maynard Keynes saw it coming in 1919. He wrote, "If we aim deliberately at the impoverishment of Central Europe, vengeance, I dare predict, will not limp." He was right. Vengeance came. 60 million people died. And the economic structures that made it possible were built in large part by the same nations that would later fight to stop it. That's what historians often get wrong about World War II. It wasn't just a story of armies and battles, of heroes and villains. It was a story of money, of debts that couldn't be paid, of capital that flowed where profit beckoned, of economic systems that created political monsters. Understanding this doesn't diminish the courage of those who fought against fascism. It doesn't excuse the crimes of the Nazi regime. But it does remind us that preventing the next catastrophe requires more than military strength or moral clarity. It requires understanding how economic forces shape political outcomes, how financial instability creates opportunities for extremism, how the pursuit of profit can enable the worst atrocities. That's a lesson worth remembering, because the next crisis is always closer than we think. If this exploration of hidden history resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel. And we're digging into the economic forces that shape our world, the power structures that operate behind the scenes, and the stories that the mainstream narratives often leave out. Hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.